Okay, hello guys. Thank you for joining me and welcome to today's video. We have Professor Dave Randall who is joining us again, which I'm very pleased. And the topic of today's video is called The World of Work and the Toyota Way. So for you guys, just a brief overview. Toyota has 14 management principles which can be applied in business. And the two main principles which underpin their work ethic are respect and making continual improvement, using making incremental improvements over time. So these really are the two core values which underpin Toyota's work. Now, after World War II, Toyota used the just-in-time production method to reduce waste and to make the company more agile to serve its customers better. So first of all, Dave, thank you very much for coming back. Big warm welcome.
Well, hi there.
Hi. So
very fine introduction.
Thank you, Dave. So Dave, I know you've had a lot of experience kind of working with big organizations, and I believe you've worked in Japan as well, haven't you?
I have, yes.
Yeah. So Dave, what would you say, first of all, as like a kind of, as a way into, before we go into the questions, what would you say is like the major differences in culture between Japanese culture and like the UK culture?
Right. It's actually a very, very difficult question to answer. I'm not convinced that when we talk about culture, there are really generic features here. There's so much variation within a culture that I think it's very dangerous for somebody who doesn't actually inhabit a culture to make assumptions about a culture they visit. But I will say something about at least the Japanese public face, because anybody who goes to Japan will see a public face that's really quite different from the UK. Firstly, you will note that people are extremely polite. Lots of bowing, but you don't get the, as it were, the intimacy of greetings that you get in the UK. So people don't hug each other, they don't kiss, they bow. So quite formal, very polite, and particularly polite when there is some sort of difference in perceived hierarchy. So the level of politeness goes up significantly when you are seen as somebody who is superior in status.
Okay.
And you see that in the kinds of bowing that gets done, because people who see themselves as lower in status will bow much lower than somebody who sees themselves as higher in status. And that formality persists right through organizational life, somewhat to my surprise. I worked there for 2.5 years. I wasn't there all the time, but I was traveling back and forward and working with a large company, not Toyota. I'm not going to say who it was. And before I ever went there, I was spoken to by a colleague of mine who I've known for many, many years, who actually works in a Japanese university. And she was the person who originally invited me to participate in the project that I worked on. And the first thing she said to me is that you must call the boss in this organization, who unusually was a woman. And in Japanese culture, that's quite unusual. You must call her Mrs. So-and-so. You must not call her by her first name. Okay. So it was, for the sake of argument, San. That wasn't her name. Yeah.
Yeah. And
I noticed when they spoke to me in meetings, they called me sensei, which I thought was rather strange, because I associate that with kickboxing or things like that. But it just means expert. And in much the same way, San at the end of a name just means Mr. or Mrs. So it means less than you think, but it's seen as quite rude to speak to somebody who's of a different status to yourself with their first names. Having said that, of course, in a large organization, these people aren't parochial. The people I work with, many of them had master's degrees from a Californian university, so They knew all about Western culture. And they weren't offended if you got it wrong and accidentally called somebody by their first name, because they knew that, hey, other cultures don't behave in quite the same way. But it is absolutely true that in public, the culture is very formal, very respectful. So we, of course, with COVID, we've got quite used to wearing masks. The Japanese, I would estimate about a third of Japanese people in a large city like Tokyo, and trust me, Tokyo is as big as anything you've ever seen, about a third of them will be wearing masks all the time. And I've asked colleagues over there, why? Why do people wear masks? And you get a variety of answers. You don't get a single answer. But one of the answers is because it's respectful to other people.
Oh, okay, that's quite interesting. So it reminds me a bit of Goffman, like from following on from the last one, but this is a physical mask. Okay, so that's very interesting. So we've got like a bit of a kind of backdrop to put it into some context. So Dave, so the first question. So do you think that, you know, the two kind of core values which the Toyota way talk about, of kind of making slow, conservative, incremental improvements, and the aspect of respect, do you think that the UK could maybe use these principles, and could they be adopted in the workplace to make employees better problem solvers?
Well, again, rather difficult question to answer. The reason it's difficult is this. As you probably know, the original form of the Toyota way was introduced into Japan by an American, by Edward Deming. And Deming had 14 principles, much like the Toyota way has 14 principles, although the principles aren't exactly the same. But they do cover the same territory. They cover stuff about continuous improvement and respecting skills and so on. Now, TQM, Total Quality Management, became very fashionable in the UK as well. 20, 30 years ago, I remember at the university I worked in, there was a TQM manager. But their version of TQM, the version that was applied in my own university, was a million miles from the version that Deming advocated and the version that the Toyota way represents. Because there, in this strange British version, it was all about documentation. It was all about process. And actually, that's exactly what Deming argues against. It's very paradoxical. So that the strange situation here is something along these lines. Yes, it would be interesting if British companies did introduce something like the Toyota way in the way that Deming originally and others have argued for, but they haven't. What they've done instead is introduce a peculiarly British version of it. So, I mean, a large part of the Toyota way, and I stress I'm not an expert on the specifics of the Toyota way, although I have, as I say, I've worked in another Japanese company and I have taught TQM in the past. The problem is that what we can't be sure about is whether that the culture you want to inculcate in an organization is independent of the national culture. That's the first problem. The second problem is we don't know whether TQM or anything like it actually works. Because of course TQM, Total Quality Management, was regarded as the savior of Japanese industry after the Second World War. But since then, Japanese industry has hit some major problems and they're still applying the same techniques and same principles. And the biggest problem they've hit is the cost of wage labor, because they've been undercut by South Korea and they've been undercut by China. So for all of continuous improvement and respect for the skills of workers and so on, very few large Japanese companies make money. It's surprising, but very few make money. The company I worked for, they admitted to me that they only had one project that was making them a significant amount of money. Everything else was either running at break even or at a loss. The company was running basically reasonably well because they had one big contract which was making them a lot of money.
That's quite surprising.
It is surprising,
Yeah.
yeah. And if you follow, as it were, economic affairs, the Japanese economy has been in trouble for quite a long time. It's ex-growth, as they say. It's not been growing well. And reasons for that include things like absence of demand. Japanese people don't spend money in the way that we do.
Yeah.
And there are lots of reasons for that, but one of them is it's a very aging population. So there are, what I'm trying to get at is that there are other factors besides the organization itself that affects success and failure. But again, there are things about this approach to management that I very much like. And it's, although we don't have the same, because I've also worked in Germany extensively. In fact, I still work in Germany. And although it would be wrong to compare Germany with Japan, nevertheless, there are features of German organizational life which are rather like the Japanese environment, and which I think don't exist in quite the same way in the UK, or at least they exist less. And that is respect for skill. That in both Japan and Germany, there is a strong respect for people's skillful working. Whereas in the UK, of course, process management, business process re-engineering and so on, has been all about trying to eradicate skill, trying to replace it with standardized processes, trying to replace it with automated processes, and so on. Now, whether that turns out to be successful or not, I can't say, because that's somewhere down the line.
Because David reminds me of like the opposite of Weber's iron cage of bureaucracy, rather kind of eliminating the procedure and more focused on the outcome. Is that, would you say that's kind of what it's like? They're not kind of tied up in that red tape as
well. Again, it's difficult to compare because you can't be sure you're comparing like with like. I mean, if you know anything about the German economy, which is in comparison to ours rather successful, but it's successful as a manufacturing economy. That's the first point about it. It's also successful in respect of SMEs, small and medium enterprises. It's not the big companies in Germany that drive its economic success. It's the fact that it's what they call the Mittelstand, which is the small and medium-sized manufacturing companies. And there, they are very, very concerned with preserving skill levels on the part of their workforce. They're often, and actually this is consistent with Deming's principles, and I think with the Toyota way, they're less concerned with radical innovation. They're happy enough to use the same machineries that they used before, as long as they can be used skillfully and well. I've seen many cases in Germany of very successful factories that are profit-making, where the machineries are surprisingly ancient. Whereas I think it's more the case in the UK that we follow an American model. Except, of course, again, and I'm kind of speaking like an economist. If you look at the UK economy and what is called the productivity paradox, or basically the absence of productivity in this country, the reasons for it have nothing to do with workforces and everything to do with lack of investment. The amount that British companies invest in new technology and in their workforce and so on is very low by international standards. So you have to be very careful about continuous improvement, lean manufacturing, and so on. It's not proven to be that successful, just in time and so on. It's subject to a bunch of conditions that we take for granted. One of those conditions is, for instance, the free movement of capital. Well, welcome to the post-Brexit world, because that will not happen in the future. And there are, unless some agreement is reached, there will be serious problems in terms of just-in-time production in this country. If you know anything about the car industry, you'll know that parts move back and forward between Europe and this country several times in the course of the production of a car.
Yep.
Each time, companies that are involved in the production of motor vehicles are going to have to fill in all the forms. And that's several hours work. Now you can imagine how much delay that creates in terms of just-in-time manufacturing. It's going to be very, very difficult for large manufacturers to be lean manufacturers. It's going to be very difficult for them to adopt that kind of approach to lean manufacturing, quality management, and so on, in a situation where bureaucracy is imposed on them from elsewhere. It's not internal bureaucracy, it's political bureaucracy.
Yeah. No, it's quite interesting, Dave. Yeah, because I've never thought about kind of the impact that Brexit will have on kind of the manufacturing industry in the UK, and something as simple as getting parts will now kind of be a long-winded process, potentially causing massive delays.
It's going to be very difficult. I mean, again, making predictions is always dangerous, but we know already that car companies and companies like it are anticipating serious difficulties. There is a political process here that's difficult to predict, but the car companies have made threatening noises about leaving Britain. No, that doesn't mean they will, but they have made threatening noises for exactly those reasons. Their costs increase, the time taken increases, and basically the main factor that would mitigate against them leaving this country is low labour costs.
Yeah.
If it becomes more expensive in terms of labour to produce stuff elsewhere, they will have second thoughts. I suspect that that's not going to be the case for some years yet.
Yeah. Okay. So Dave. So the second question is: so how significant do you think a country's culture is in its overall work ethic, like in organisations and kind of as a whole, generally speaking?
My instinctive answer is not very, but there are lots of theorists who disagree with me. I don't know if you know, for instance, Geert Hofstede's work. Hofstede worked for IBM and is a very famous theorist about national culture. And he argues that national culture is hugely important in terms of the way in which industrial and commercial life is conducted. I don't remember the details of his argument because I don't think much of it, but he argues that there are dimensions that are important in terms of the way in which business is conducted. They include things like power hierarchies, how far apart are people of high status and people of low status. Things like whether the culture is masculine or feminine, and so on. There's, depending on the version you look at, something between 4 and 6 of these cultural variables. Now, I'm not convinced that, in fact, I'm very unconvinced that he's right about this. I think organizational culture is much, much more important than national culture. And it seems to me that where I have seen what I will call managerial failures in Britain, it is largely because management sees itself as exercising control, where there's an absence of trust by and large. And that is consistent with what we're talking about when we talk about the Toyota way, which is very much based on the idea that there is trust between manager and worker. And the effect that has in its worst cases is to make workers indifferent to results. So the company I work for, they actually have outlets in the UK. And their researchers have said to me that they see a striking difference between the way, for instance, Japanese workers manage their tools to the way British workers don't manage their tools. So they will say that at the end of every day, a skilled Japanese worker will walk around, pick up every tool he or she has used, and put them back in the place they are supposed to be in, so that tomorrow they or somebody else can pick them up and start afresh. In exactly the same manufacturing environment, I am told that British workers just leave things where they last put them.
Yeah.
So they don't do things like walk around and pick stuff up and make sure everything's ready for the next shift or for the next day, and so on. Now, that's not a comment about British workers. Don't misunderstand me. It's a comment about organizational culture. That organizational cultures at their worst mean that if you don't trust workers, they won't behave in a trustful way. And I do believe that's true. I believe that if you trust working people, they will repay your trust. If you don't trust them, they won't.
Yeah.
And one of the difficulties is in an organizational culture is, I mean, notoriously it is the case that organizational cultures are very hard to change.
Yeah. Because Dave, I was reading an article in a journal article, and it was saying that do you know, in Japan, they regard like teachers, that they have the same status as like government officials. Is that true? Because I remember you saying at the beginning about how
yes, I think it is. I mean, teachers have astonishingly low status in the UK. Let's face it. There's very little respect for educators in this country. Possibly more for university educators than school educators, but I come from a generation where there used to be a great deal more respect. When I was at school, there was a great deal more respect for teachers than there is now. And certainly, I mean, I've given lectures in Japan, and there's an awful lot of very, very respectful attentiveness. People give every impression that they are listening to every word that you say. You give a lecture in the UK, and you know perfectly well that if it's a big class, the kids at the back of the room are playing on their phones. They're on Facebook or Instagram or what have you. In Japan, you would not see that, and that kind of respectfulness comes across in education as well as in commercial life. Whether I don't know exactly why that is. I mean, as I said. You see it in public life in Japan, as I've already said. You do see it everywhere in public life. There's a service ethic, and you see it in very surprising ways. Let me give you two examples of things that have happened to me that really took me aback because it was so extremely polite. So in one instance, I was staying in a hotel in Tokyo, and it was raining heavily, and I didn't have an umbrella with me. And I thought, I wonder if they've got one at reception in the hotel. I'll stop off at reception in order to ask whether they've got an umbrella that I could possibly borrow, knowing that many hotels do keep umbrellas that their guests can borrow. So I walked into reception, and before I got to the reception desk, this young woman came running out from behind the desk and gave me an umbrella. Oh. I didn't even ask for it. She just knew what I wanted. She saw the heavy rain, big smile, presented me with an umbrella. And away I went perfectly happy. And on exactly the same day, when I went to the offices of the firm I was working with, and I, as usual, got there a bit early, so I went into a coffee shop just across the road, doing what I did most mornings, have a quick cup of coffee and a muffin or something before I went to work. And again, a young woman came running out from behind the counter and brushed my shoulders off because there was a bit of rain on my shoulders. You can't imagine that happening in the UK. Yeah, you kind of. I mean, it's probably a bit unfair, but one's impression of service in the UK is not that people are going out of their way to be nice to you. They are professionally nice, but they're not going to go out of their way. I mean,
sorry.
No, go on. You.
Dave, I was just thinking that there's been an increased emphasis in I think many colleges and universities where there's an emphasis that students are considered customers, and it's kind of run a bit more like a business. Do you think that kind of approach, where as we're seen as like teachers are seen as like service providers, there's an increased the students have like in their mind that teachers should be more providing because they're providing a service, and that's what led to kind of the fragmentation of kind of manners basically in some colleges, universities, and maybe filtering down into schools with like league tables and these kind of things.
To an extent, I'm in two minds about this. Being absolutely, I mean, you were a university student, Tariq, so you know as well as I do, there's some really terrible teachers in universities. And I think teachers should be accountable. I don't think you should be allowed to be that bad. And some are. And at university level, it's partly because you don't get promoted for being a good teacher. You get promoted on the back of research activities. And at schools, it's because there was, in the past, there was never any mechanism to sack the really awful people. And there were some really awful teachers at school. So in that respect, I think accountability is a good thing. I think teachers and lecturers and so on should be accountable for the quality of the work they do. Having said that, I think students should be accountable too. I think it is wrong for students to assume that you do the work for them. You know, this idea that somehow you are paid to ensure that they pass exams is totally wrong. You are paid to support their efforts in passing exams, and you should do your best for them. I'm absolutely committed to the idea that you should do your best for students. But doing your best is not passing the exam for them. And we are seeing, I think, some unfortunate consequences to that kind of consumer culture. As much as just a cultural shift, it's about competition in schools and in universities. Yeah. Because there is competition, they have to kind of offer more to their students. And in universities, one of the awful things that's happened as a result of that is grade inflation. So I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but well over a third of students last year in British universities got first-class honours degrees.
Well, David, do you know what it reminds me of you if you're just saying that? I've got one of my friends actually is senior university lecturer at Salford. He teaches criminology, and he studied his degree, his undergraduate was LLB law degree, and I think there's one of the lecturers there. So what he did, he found one of his old essays, which he got, I think, he said he got a 2-1 for, and he scribbled out his name and he gave it to him, and he said, "Oh, just do me a favour, just mark this student's work for me." And he said to him, "Oh, this is a first," but he got when he did it in the 90s, he got a 2-1 for that.
There's no surprise to me at all. As I say, roughly a third of all students in universities today get first. The figure, well, I can remember my first year teaching at MMU, when we gave a first to a student in the sociology department. I remember my head of department saying to me, "Do you know, that's the first we've given for 5 years."
Wow.
In other words, it was exceptional. Now, you know, MMU will be like any other university. It'll be dishing out a lot of them. Now, again, need to be careful. It's in and of itself, the grade doesn't matter. But from the point of view of employers, they want to know that what they're getting is somebody who is competent, yeah, who can add up, who can write clearly,
yeah,
and so on. And that's not always what they're getting. And there is a bit of a disconnect, I think, now between the expectations of people out there in, as they say, the real world, and what is going on in universities and other educational institutions.
Yeah.
Standards are not as high as they used to be. And again, I've got to stress here, because it's a personal view. Universities don't exist to give you degrees. They exist as educational institutions. They're there to educate you. And I've had lots and lots of students who start from a very, very low background and who have improved dramatically over 3 years, but still don't get a great degree. They may still end up with a 2-2, but they started from a very low position. And I think that we've done a great job where we see a student who starts from a very poor position and ends up with a 2-2. What matters is progress, and what matters in the end is whether you have given students an experience which is valuable. I'm not convinced that we do in the sense that we prepare them for careers. It's quite clear if you look at the statistics that whether there's a monetary advantage from going to university largely depends on which university you go to and which degree course you follow. But you know, you have to, it's for you and any individual to decide whether that matters.
Yeah.
What I do think the university should have done a long time ago is been honest. I think they should be honest about what you can expect. So when students come in to do, for the sake of argument, criminology, because they watch Cracker or what have you on television, they think, oh, it's looks really exciting. Or come in to do psychology, not realizing that psychology is a highly mathematical discipline, and you'd better be good at stats if you want to do psychology, and so on. Universities are a bit dishonest because they're now in a competitive market. They compete with each other. They want more students. They're afraid that the university down the road might steal their students, and so on. Because of that, they I think, tend to be a little bit dishonest about what students can expect.
Yeah.
And so are schools, I think, you know, that where schools are full of this rhetoric that the university is the right place for you. You know, you'll have a much more successful career if you go to university. And it's not necessarily true.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's quite interesting, because I think, like you said, Dave, like red brick universities will always be kind of successful, won't they? Because they're known like globally, internationally, like Oxbridge, you know.
Well, the so-called Russell Group universities, yeah. the sort of top 10 to 12, around that number, and they include Oxford and Cambridge, of course.
Okay.
Yes, they will always be more successful than the others, and they can set higher standards in terms of entry grades, and so on. And the same is true of certain disciplines. If you want to study medicine, for instance, you know, pretty much every university in the country will ask you for 3 A's at A-level minimum.
Yeah.
They can afford to set very high entry grades because the demand exceeds the supply.
Yeah. So Dave, so the next question is, with the current global coronavirus pandemic, do you think this will accelerate the creation of like digital cages of bureaucracy, a bit like Weber's iron cage of bureaucracy, yeah. So that after the lockdown is fully ended, do you think all of these digital cages and maybe digital processes will kind of find themselves into a physical workplace as a new form of red tape?
I don't know that it's new. I think that the notion of the iron cage fairly accurately represents a lot of what goes on in modern organizational life. The routinization of work, the control over workforces that we often see. That's pretty much what Weber meant by the iron cage of bureaucracy, although he also had a political dimension to that. Do I think that COVID makes a difference here, or that the digital environment makes a difference? Yes and no. There's some evidence right now that companies are using surveillance technologies to check that their workers at home are actually at work. So spyware. There is some evidence that companies are using spyware to ensure that you know, it's easy enough to have spyware installed on a computer so they can see what you're doing. And that, well, it's not very nice. It's not very nice to know that, you know, at any moment you can be sitting in front of your computer and somebody else is looking out of your webcam and watching your screen behavior, your cursor behavior, to see exactly what you're up to. And that is a new form of surveillance in the sense that it's more complete than what we've ever had in the past. Having said that, anybody who's ever worked in an office knows that you waste an awful lot of time in an office. There isn't always anything to do. And I'm not sure whether this kind of surveillance technology will be widely adopted. I suspect it won't. I know that managers in some instances are reluctant. They're not happy with the fact that people are working at home. My neighbour across the road from me, who's a town planner, he's been at home for, well, 6 months now. And he says that his bosses, senior people in the local council, were very unhappy with the idea that he was working from home to begin with, but that actually, he says, they've become more relaxed because they've realized that in terms of productivity, he's probably getting more done. And the reason, of course, is he doesn't have to travel. Yeah. And I used to find the same thing as a lecturer at university, that I used to work harder when I was at home because I didn't have to spend an hour and a half getting to work. So it's unclear. Yeah. You know, there will be organizational environments where surveillance becomes more common, and you know, what Weber called the iron cage entails more and more control. That will happen in some places. It doesn't mean it'll happen everywhere. I don't think COVID is a particularly relevant matter here, because it's going to be quite a while before we find out whether people are happy at home or not. That first flush of working from home, people realize that, you know, there are freedoms that they didn't previously have. They can be in an office in their underpants because nobody can see, you know, the lower part of the desk, and so on. And they can have a cup of coffee when they feel like it, all these things. So in the first flush, a lot of people enjoy working from home, but there are obvious medium-term costs to it. And they include the cost of things like networking. Again, most of us who ever worked in organizations know the importance of networking with your colleagues and with people who are more senior than themselves, getting on with people, if you like.
Yeah.
Well, if you're not seeing them at all, it's impossible for you to impress them.
Yeah.
And so if you have any kind of vision of your career, as it were, being more successful, working from home is going to be a disaster for you. And I think that it's also rather isolating. That what is likely to happen, I think, is something of a hybrid model. I think people will, if they can, they will work from home part of the week, but they will also want to go into work part of the week, which is what I did as a lecturer, and it was perfect for me. I was in work 3 days a week and at home writing the other 2 days a week. Yeah, and I was always very, very happy with that, because I didn't get interrupted. When I was at home, I didn't get interrupted, so I could get on with stuff much faster.
Yeah.
No, I don't see that as, I see that as more liberating rather than more controlling. And if you are allowed to, if management sees what you do as about product, not about process, then they ought to be happy for you to work at home.
Yeah.
I often say to my students in Germany, it doesn't matter whether you're in the building or not, and it doesn't matter whether you're there late or not. What matters is, are you producing the things that you need to produce? Publish papers, etc., etc. If you are, no one gives a damn about whether you're there at 5 in the evening or not. And it's going back to Japanese culture, it is well known that there is a cost to that kind of deferential organizational life in Japan, which is that notoriously people are reluctant to leave the building before the boss, which actually means a lot of the time you're sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So what looks like a healthy organizational context is nothing of the kind. It's people just sitting there.
Because Dave, one of my friends, he was just after we finished university, he went to study chartered accountancy, and he was telling me that when he started in his company, who he was working for, the person was speaking with him, and he was saying, we finish, I think, 8 till 6, but I get really angry when I see people leaving at 6 o'clock, because as part of the culture, they have to stay for a longer time. And that was kind of like the unwritten rules, you know, the culture of the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's still fairly common. Whether it is productive is a whole different issue. I think, you know, going back to some of the earlier points we were making, I don't think British management is very good. I think there is generally a culture of control, and that creates a culture of obedience. And a culture of obedience doesn't necessarily mean an effective culture. Doing what you're told is not necessarily the same thing as doing good work. And I know how resentful academics get about attempts to control their lives. And all I can say is I've been very productive in my academic life. I've published an awful lot of stuff, and I would like to think that I was a good teacher and that people appreciated me for that as well. And I did all that without anybody ever telling me what to do. Nobody was on my back.
Oh, sorry.
Well, you know, do you imagine in situations like that things will be better if there's a great deal more control? I mean, in one sense, it's clear that in a certain way, it will be better in that if you can get rid of the dross, if you can get rid of the terrible teachers and the lazy buggers who don't do anything, that's got to be a good thing. But how many of them are there? Because my own experience is the answer is not that many. And if the effect is to penalize those people who are working very hard anyway, to make their lives more difficult and to make them more resentful, again, there's a lot of organizational psychology, which in effect comes down to a happy worker is a good worker. So if the effect of increasing control is to make workers in the widest sense, including professional people, more resentful of their organizational culture, then it's counterproductive. And I genuinely believe this. I think the biggest problem in terms of British organizations can't be summed up in terms of philosophies like TQM or the Toyota way or what have you. They can be summed up as very poor management over a long period of time, which has led to a workforce that in a lot of contexts is basically quite resentful.
Dave,
doesn't want to do the job.
Dave, because I think control is kind of stifles creativity, and it's creativity where some people get the best work. I mean, because I remember your lessons because they're really fun, and I think that came across because you were saying that you were trusted just to kind of get on with the things, and as long as you kind of produce what you need to produce, it doesn't really matter how you get it. You're not concerned so much with the process.
Yeah, as I say, well, of course, it's not true of all occupations. I mean, the nice thing about being an academic is only the product matters. The process is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how you get your work published, as long as you get it published. The universities have measurement systems. There is what's called the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, where they measure your outputs. Yeah. To see how good your work is and how widely it's cited and so on and so forth. So there are measurements in place. Even in terms of teaching now, there are measurements in place in the universities, which never used to be. What I fear, because you use the word creative, I don't fear it for myself because I'm retired, so I don't care. But what I fear is that if a particular vision of how things should be done comes to dominate, it removes variation, it removes creativity. A lot of older secondary school teachers complain about the fact that they're no longer able to do the creative things they used to be able to do because they're absolutely caught by the syllabus. And I would be very sorry to see that in universities. And I don't think it's healthy in any organizational context to be constantly monitored, surveilled, and told what to do. I don't think it creates a workforce that is more productive. In my experience, and I've done a lot of consultancy work and a lot of work in what I would call ethnographic work in organizations, I have never yet worked in a context where I looked around me and saw people who were trying not to do their work.
Yeah.
And I've done work in lots of different contexts, and everywhere I've been, people's own sense of pride, their own sense of self-worth is what motivates them. That they do their jobs, with some exceptions, obviously, but by and large, people want to do their job properly.
Yeah. So Dave, thank you for that. So I've just got the last question now. So in all the countries you've visited, so what would you say are the main differences with regards to people's working practices? And like a sweet shop, if you could pick the kind of best aspects, what would they be?
The three countries I know best in terms of work, in terms of being able to see how organizations operate, are Japan, Germany, and Sweden. They're not all the same. As I've already said, Japan is quite hierarchical and has various process devices in play. What makes it work when it works is the motivation of the workforce, and I think that's genuine. I think those ideologies of continuous improvement do recognize the importance of skill, of creativity, of individual quality, and so on. And it's rewarded by letting people get on with things. In Germany, things are, I think, in a similar way, quite hierarchical. But because of the kind of business that Germany is successful at, which is engineering and manufacturing in relatively small companies, in SMEs, skill is regarded as hugely important. Skillful workers are very highly paid in Germany, much better paid than they are in the UK. In Sweden, something very different is going on in Sweden, because in Sweden they've become a digital economy, and so opportunities there are very much geared to new enterprises of one kind or another, most of which are to do with computing and its applications. Lots of small companies. People work very, very hard, but they're not working hard because they're being told to. They're working hard because they see, well, basically because they see profit at the end of it. They see that they will be much better off as a result, at least for those people who can. There is always, of course, a left behind population. And that's true of every country. There is always a left behind population, as in Germany and Japan. Japan much less so, because Japan politically is much more concerned with looking after its less fortunate people. But in Germany, pretty much as in Britain, there is a left behind population. And for those people, life is very, very different. So I can't tell you much about them, really. In terms of organizational life, I would like to see British companies be more innovative. I'd like to see management be more interested in modern technology, but not with a view to replacing workers, with a view to seeing how people can work with new technology. I think maybe last week we talked a little bit about AI.
Yeah.
And big data. Big data is a great example of this, and we've seen it in the past week with the farce over exam results. Well, it's actually completely relevant to our discussion, because the reason for that is that they relied entirely on a mechanical algorithm without ever testing it out and without ever looking at the data to see what its ramifications might be. In other words, no human hands touch this. And if you think about it, I mean, my kind of second discipline is computing, or at least information systems. One of the lessons we try to teach, and have tried to teach over 40 years, is you should never, ever run a system from zero through to full operation without testing it, without piloting it, and you should always have a backup, so that when things go belly up, you survive it. And they absolutely didn't do that. They designed an algorithm, some computer scientists who've never taught in their lives, know nothing about how schools work and so on, bunch of civil servants in much the same situation, designed an algorithm, didn't test it, didn't analyze the results, didn't, for instance, test it on a data set from last year, and the results are there for everybody to see. Total chaos, shambolic.
Yeah.
And that's a result of assuming that the technology will do the work for you. In my view, the best organizational solutions are where you use modern technology in conjunction with expert workers. And in a place like Sweden, for instance, I had a master's student this year who did a study of data analytics, a company where people are working on very large data sets, and they're human beings. They're sitting there looking at these data sets and working out what they might mean, working out how they're relevant to business life and so on. Yeah, you will not find many competent data analysts in Great Britain as yet.
So it's like complementary. So it's not like in isolation. It's kind of how data can complement working with humans rather than leaving it exclusively just to a computer.
Yes, I don't see any logical reason why new technology should lead to unemployment. Lots of people are afraid that it will. I don't share that view. It often creates new employment opportunities. But the best and most successful innovations are a combination of new technology and highly skilled workforces, in my opinion.
Okay, lovely. Well, I think we're nearly out of time now. So I just want to say first of all to Dave, thank you very much again for your time. It's real honor and privilege to have you. Fantastic lecturer. I remember that's why I got in contact with you, because I remember you, and I think 3 or 4 other lecturers who I did kind of who I've kept in contact with over the years. So thank you so much for coming, to take part. It's really interesting, learning, all the information you're giving. And to the audience, again, please have a look in the links in the description below, and I will put Professor Dave Randall's link to some of his work, so you can have a look at some of his work, I think on Google Scholar as well. So I'll put all that in the description below. So again, as always, any questions or comments, please put it in the chat box below. And until next time, please like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Tariq, and see you next time.
Okay.